Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this evening on managing anxiety. I'm so excited to have this conversation. I think it's a really important conversation to have, so I hope that you get loads from it. My name is Lou Richards, and I lead the pastoral care team at Christchurch, London. And today I'm going to be chatting to Will Van Der Hart. And Will is the one of the founding directors of an informational think tank all about mental health and emotional well-being. He's also the pastoral chaplain at HTB. He's an amazing speaker and communicator. I've actually been at a conference before where I couldn't even get into his talk because it was so busy. So I'm so thrilled to be chatting to you today, Will. So hello.
Hi, Lou. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. I've got a pile of questions for you, so I'm going to get going. And If you are watching this and you have questions, please just write them in the comments and they are going to come through to me and I will ask as many questions as I can. So first of all, Will, one of the reasons I really wanted to chat to you today and invite you on this webinar is because I know you have a personal experience with anxiety. So would you mind kicking us off by just sharing a little bit about your experience?
Absolutely. I mean, when I started work, I had no ambition to run a mental health ministry charity, and I was all into sports, and I would run away from anything that was sort of felt too heavy. But I actually come from a family with quite a strong history of anxiety and depression. We tended not to talk too much about it, but it was definitely there growing up. And then I think I had a few experiences of anxiety, particularly panic, as a younger person. And I used to worry my way to school. I definitely remember like agonizing cyclical worries on the way to school and a churny tummy. And I even go to the doctors a few times to talk about, my churny tummy and what I could do about it. But I kept it all very, very suppressed. And it wasn't until I started work, I'm a priest, I started work in central London, and I got involved in the London bombings in 2005. I was actually, I kind of ended up on site and was hosting the emergency service response out of a small church hall next door to the Edgware Road station. I got really involved and was there sort of cordoned in, and I saw things and heard things that I really wasn't really prepared to see or hear. And the consequence was I had a really significant anxiety-based breakdown about 3 months after that event. It was what we call sort of post-traumatic stress. It was quite acute. I had just significant number of panic attacks every day, 9 or 10 panic attacks. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I needed medication therapy and a sort of quite a long journey of recovery. I think that was back in 2005. And I think there was a huge amount more mental health stigma then than there is actually today. And people didn't really talk too much about it. So I was on quite a lonely journey, but fortunately I had a really great friend from Cambridge who was another student friend, and he'd become a very, very eminent psychiatrist. So he helped me recover. And then we started blogging online together about mental health, which was just at the time interesting and felt important. And now we have about 4.5 million people on our site every year, hitting our site for information, which is a total accident. But it's a real privilege to be able to speak in this area. So yeah, I've become hugely passionate as a sort of mental health advocate.
Wow, that just sounds like it must have been such a hard journey for you with that anxiety. How long would you say what period of time are we talking about in terms of your recovery?
Well, I've always been quite nervous about blaming everything on the London bombings, because it's, again, part of the stigma is to sort of say, oh, well, it's legitimate that I had an anxiety-based breakdown because of this event. Unfortunately, most people don't have, if you like, the opportunity to blame an event, and therefore they feel more stigmatized because they feel like they're not justified. And I would just say my problems began well before the London bombings, and they were, if you like, the straw that broke the camel's back. But actually, my problem with anxiety, as I've tried to explain, stems into my teenage years. And therefore, we say it takes as long to walk into a problem as it does to walk out of it. I had, about 3 months off work. I had about a 6-month significant recovery window. and I've made a really good recovery, but I still have a GAD diagnosis, which is called generalized anxiety disorder. So I would say over the last 15 years, largely I'm like this, but I do go like this, and sort of, find my anxiety levels fluctuate. I mean, the most common experience I have is this feeling like I've just dropped my keys down a drain. So I have this kind of feeling of dread that kind of goes, oh, and I realise now it's the functioning of my brain, and I don't pay it too much attention. But when you're anxious, you tend to overread your own psychological health, and also you scan your body for any physiological changes, and that tends to keep the spiral of anxiety alive. So you start off being worried about something, and then you start worrying about your worrying, and it becomes a kind of echo chamber where you're constantly really scanning and struggling. So it takes a while to work through, but just to encourage people that actually I'm doing well, and recovery is totally possible. And if you're struggling with anxiety, I mean, pray you don't have it as acutely as I did, but if you do, it's possible to walk free. And if you're struggling with anxiety, you can live really well with anxiety. So it's not like if you've experienced anxiety, if you've been to your doctor to talk about anxiety, it's not a life of struggle. It definitely isn't. And remember that anxiety is not like depression. Depression is an illness, a categorized illness. With anxiety, it's actually helpful and functional. We're not trying to get away from our anxiety. We're just trying to bring our anxiety into a level which is appropriate for the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So it's about dialing down the volume rather than trying to edit anxiety out of our lives altogether.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, isn't it? Because it can be easy to have quite black and white thinking and think I either have it or I don't, or if I have it, then I need to not have it. When actually it's not necessarily about that, is it? It's just about having it, I guess, it not impacting your life too adversely, or being able to manage it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a bit like a car alarm. We lived in Harrow for a while, and I had a neighbour who had quite an old Audi that he was very proud of, and he'd installed a very powerful alarm to protect it. I didn't actually think anyone would steal it, but he'd installed this very significant alarm. And unfortunately, if a leaf fell off a tree or a squirrel brushed past it with its tail, the alarm would go off, which was a total nightmare, because at night time, if he'd parked it outside my house, my children would be awake, I would be awake, it would go off 3 or 4 times in the night. It was a very good alarm. It was just too good. And I think for those of us who struggle with anxiety, it's like your alarm is an excellent alarm. It just goes off when there's too mild a stimulus. Most people's alarm should go off when a burglar's smashing the window of the car. It shouldn't go off when a squirrel runs across the bonnet. And it's about turning down the sensitivity so you have an appropriate level of security, rather than this hypersensitized limbic system, which is what causes the emotional alarm to go off all the time and propagate these kind of anxiety issues. There's things we can do to help ourselves with that, but we have to work with the system we have in place at the time.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful analogy, actually. And just going back to your own story, I think there are obviously so many strategies and tips we can give, but I think there's something so powerful in hearing someone else's story and knowing, oh, I'm not alone, or I'm not the only person who feels that way or thinks that way. There's not something fundamentally wrong with me as a person. So I'm really grateful that you shared that story. And for anyone who has recently tuned in, then welcome to our webinar on managing anxiety. I'm having a great chat with my new friend Will, all about his experience of anxiety. And I guess my next question is partly kind of what we've been talking about already, in that if there's someone who is really struggling right now, what would you say to them as kind of your best words of wisdom to what they should do right now?
So my best advice is always to see your GP. Most people leave it far too long to actually instigate help. And walking out of anxiety is, it's a journey that you definitely can win, but it's a journey that we all do better in when you get help. And part of the anxiety journey is about editing out other concerns. So some of the symptoms of anxiety can be biologically created. So, for example, an overactive thyroid gland can mimic quite a lot of the manifestations of anxiety. It's really important if someone who's watching has been struggling with a significant level of anxiety where they may be having physiological experiences like panic attacks, cold hands and feet, headaches, sweating, a tight band around the head, tummy problems. If you're having those problems, you can book a double appointment with your GP and that double appointment gives you 20 minutes, not 10, to discuss your emotional health. And about between a third and a quarter of all GP appointments relate to people's emotional and mental health. So your doctor won't feel that you're wasting time. You know, they'll welcome you, they'll talk to you compassionately, they'll take a full medical history, and they'll give you helpful advice. So the first and most important kind of golden rule is actually that you see your healthcare provider as a first port of call. And once you've done that, you can be confident that you know what you're dealing with, and then you can enlist other sorts of support. But the first thing to do is to know this is the problem that you're struggling with. Now, there will be people on this call who have that kind of level of acute anxiety. And there'll be other people who say, well, I'm not that anxious, but I do struggle with worry and occasional bouts of feeling uncomfortable where anxiety is concerned. They might not feel that it's the right time for them to go to see the doctor. But again, my advice is still, if you're in doubt, definitely speak to your GP. But they might want to list other sorts of activity to see whether they can bring their anxiety or worry under control before they then take that step. So the key thing is know that there's help out there, and know that actually people will welcome you to get those conversations started. And there are lots of different strands to recovery. So we talk about the kind of cognitive strand, understanding what we're thinking and how what we're thinking about can affect our mood and our physiology. Then there's the biological aspects of anxiety and how we can actually help our body to cope and manage with anxiety. There's also a pharmacological aspect of that. That just means medication. And some people will benefit from two sorts of medication. One group's called the benzidine. They're sort of a relaxant drug that helps people when they're acutely anxious for a short period of time. And then there's medications called SSRI medications. They're anti-anxiety or antidepressant medications. And there's a whole family of those, and they tend to be for longer use, and many of them are focused on reducing anxiety. So depending on where someone's at, there'll be different sorts of tools that they might need for recovery. And some folk might be slightly afraid of the idea that their doctor will ply them with tablets as soon as they arrive. They absolutely will not. They will assess and listen to you very carefully. But for some people, that is an important part of their journey of recovery. And for me, I needed to use antidepressant medication for a season in order to help my mind and body recover. That's not everyone's journey, but it's important, again, to reduce stigma around that and say, actually, that's absolutely okay. And if that's what your doctor's suggesting, that's actually really helpful.
Yeah.
People tend to be happy to take medication around physical disease, but they struggle where emotional mental disease is concerned. And I would just say, if you can take paracetamol, you're never treating a pain in your body with paracetamol. You're only treating your brain. So if you're happy to take paracetamol, you should also be happy to take any other medication that your doctor prescribes, which impacts your brain.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think the stigma is definitely changing around antidepressant medication or anti-anxiety medication. One question that I'm asked quite often is, how do I know if my level of anxiety is excessive? And how do I know, I guess, how do I know if it's really a problem, or is this just normal?
It's a great question. And I would say normally when people start actually asking other people whether their level of anxiety is normal, that they've crossed the threshold into what isn't actually normal. We all have a social conscience where we feel slightly ashamed or embarrassed when we ask people unnecessary questions. And or when we confess or describe things vulnerably. And so that is a barrier normally to our level of discomfort. And therefore we only cross that barrier when we feel significantly uncomfortable. And so I would say if you have backed away several times from telling a friend and you generally feel fine, you might find yourself below that threshold. But if you actually step across that line and start saying things like, is it normal that I feel this anxious? I would say you probably are in the more anxious category. I mean, sometimes psychologists and psychiatrists apply a kind of a quota amount to worry. So there might be a threshold. particularly where obsessive disorders are concerned. They might say if you spend more than an hour a day, every day, performing rituals that might reduce your anxiety, or locked into a state of high anxiety, then that might mean that you've crossed the threshold. But I would say to people, it is quite subjective. And if you feel uncomfortable, and particularly if physical symptoms are becoming manifest in your experience, if you experience those sort of palpitations in your heart or feelings of physical discomfort, it's definitely time to start talking seriously about your journey of recovery. And I would say I probably spent my worst time in my life, 90% of my time worrying about something. And now I probably spend 10% of my time worrying about something. And is a horrible time to only have 10% of your life with any sort of headspace. And unfortunately, I've met many people who've gone 10, 15, even 30 years with that kind of worry level, but never having really described it or discussed it with anyone else. And that's heartbreaking.
It really is heartbreaking, isn't it? Because if you spend that long feeling like that way, it becomes normal to you. And so for people to be kind of just carrying on with life with that level of worry or anxiety, it really is heartbreaking, because who's able to live life to the full when they're spending that much time feeling anxious is so difficult. And so your suggestion of going to the GP and getting help is just such a valuable one, because everyone wants to live their best life, don't they?
Absolutely. I mean, and there's some anxiety disorders specifically which propagate a sense of shame, which so often impacts people with these sort of problems, that they talk themselves out of ever getting help because they feel that they'll be embarrassed if they do. And one particular disorder, which is again quite prevalent amongst teenagers and younger people, is spectrum OCD disorder. So this is obsessive compulsive disorder, and it encompasses a very large range of different anxiety issues, but obsessional thinking is one of them. And unfortunately, I think the average onset to diagnosis for that disorder is 17 years. That's the average onset to diagnosis, because there's so much shame in actually beginning to talk about some of the intrusive thoughts that people are suffering from. And my real encouragement again is, often people who are struggling with obsessive thinking, they believe themselves to be bad. They might imagine things which are socially abhorrent, but recoil from them. They're called ego dystonic thoughts. They're thoughts that go against a person's sense of self. And because of the shame...
Sorry, just give me a couple of real life examples of what those thoughts might be.
Yeah, so an ego dystonic thought might be to hurt someone that you love. I remember working with a school teacher who was terrified that she might hurt the children with some scissors. And so she actually hid all of the scissors in her classroom in a box and locked it in the cupboard. And of course, the children in the classroom were saying, "But Miss, can we have some scissors?" And she was always making an excuse about why they couldn't have any scissors. Now, you can understand that this woman was worried about her safeguarding, for example. And this was probably slightly before that was so prevalent in terms of people's mindset. Actually, what she was doing was she was struggling massively with obsessive thinking. She was actually a very safe person. It's very important to say that to anyone watching. She was an extremely safe person, and she was a very good teacher, but her mind was tormenting her with this kind of imagery, which made her feel very ashamed. And because she felt ashamed and frightened for her career, she didn't seek help. And actually, she's having had conversations with her, she realized what she was struggling with. She went to see her doctor. She got great treatment. There's great treatment available. And she was able to get free from that pattern of behavior and carry on being a great school teacher. So those kind of thoughts, sometimes, there's a whole range of thoughts, but people struggle generally with things that they find unpleasant. And so people with obsessive thinking can think all sorts of terrible things, but they're not actually things that they want to think. They're things that intrude in their minds. And that intrusion is often safety orientated. So their brain's saying, "Don't ever do this." And then they think, "Oh, because I had that thought, maybe I secretly want to do this." And that secret sort of that question or that doubt about whether or not they thought that thought because they secretly want that particular thing keeps the spiral of obsession alive. And it can be very life limiting. And so again, if someone's listening, a young person who maybe feels like, oh, I have this terrible thought and it keeps me up at night, then again, explore obsessive thinking. I know Anxiety UK have a great site around that, and then seek help. There's lots of great help out there. OCD is definitely not about arranging Coke cans in order, or organising your cutlery, or doing up your shoelaces in a particular way. So they're all stigmatic subtypes, which aren't really the problem for people.
Yeah, which is really important that you said that, actually, because I think you're right. There still is quite a lot of stigma or preconceptions around some of these subjects, and we can group anxiety in, like, there's so much within anxiety to just be aware of, isn't there? And just thinking about this current moment that we're in, a lot of people I have spoken to have said how actually being in lockdown, it actually kind of allays some of their worries, because they're not having to go out and go into the big wide world, or maybe they're not, well, yeah, health-wise, if they're staying at home, then they're okay. What advice would you give to people who are struggling with the anxiety of transitioning back to kind of normal life?
Yeah, thanks. It's such a good question. We all struggle to a level with something called agoraphobia. And this is this idea of actually being in big spaces with lots of people. And some people have an agoraphobic diagnosis. I've actually met a few people struggling significant agoraphobia and actually can't leave the house at all. The trouble with that worry is it's not benign. Like, anxiety doesn't just stop at a certain level and say, oh, I've given this person enough torment, now I'm going to back off. Anxiety will rob you of everything that you have in concentric circles. So, for example, you might go to the hypermarket and be overwhelmed by how big it is and feel a bit panicky. So next week you decide to go to the supermarket. But in the supermarket, after a few weeks, you have the same experience. And then you go to the local Tesco's local, or there are other brands, but you walk around the aisles in your local store, and then you feel panicky there. And then you go home and then you ask for home delivery. And so what happens is the anxiety that started off in the hypermarket becomes realized in the local store. And ultimately, you end up in your home, and you're contained there because you're afraid of what's going on in the world around you. Now, there's one particular psychological tool which is called exposure and response prevention, ENRP. It's a really helpful tool. But basically, it says if you expose yourself to the thing that you're afraid of and you don't respond, you prevent your response, you will, if you like, overcome a level of anxiety and be able to step forward. So if you went back to the local store and you felt anxiety, but you didn't go back to your home, when you've been there shopping for a couple of weeks, you'll feel more confident, and then you might want to go to the supermarket again. And then if you stay in the supermarket long enough, you might actually want to then go to the hypermarket again. So exposure and response prevention is about exposing yourself and then going forward and actually taking ground back from anxiety. And I think where agoraphobia is concerned, I mean, where people have clinical agoraphobia, they need psychological support and they need to work with professional therapists. But for many people, lockdown has stolen their confidence that they can manage life in the world with all its troubles and challenges, particularly with COVID still, if you like, roaming around. And my encouragement is to take small steps, but to take steps. So try not to become, too comfortable in the security of your own home. And I think exposure works best when you take small, confident steps rather than taking massive leaps. So if someone at home is thinking, I'm quite worried about going out again, start off with a walk in the countryside. Don't go straight onto the tube in London. When you've walked in the countryside for a week and you've seen a few other people, then take your next step, which might be cycling to work for one day or whatever it is that you want to do, and then go from there and try and build up your exposure. But it's really important that people recognise that you will not ultimately, living in the bubble of home might feel safe, but ultimately is stealing your freedom. That's one of the great lies that anxiety tells you. It tells you that it's working for you, when in reality it's often working against you.
That I just know that is going to ring true for so many people. I think the lies that you kind of get told when you're struggling with anxiety can be so big and overwhelming. And I think, like you were saying earlier, we carry this sense of shame about it, so we don't necessarily want to talk about it. So then it's self-perpetuating, isn't it? We never get out of that cycle. And I think those practical suggestions seem, the way it's broken down, your suggestions of kind of just doing, a walk in the countryside rather than going straight on a tube, I think that could be really helpful. And I guess what you're saying is, don't hide away. Like, it can be tempting to, and we've obviously had to for a certain period of time. But if I'm hearing you rightly, you're saying actually it's important to get out if you're struggling.
Absolutely. I mean, life fulfillment, we do much better in community. We've been created for community and for connection. And so isolation isn't actually good for our mental health. And there are a huge amount of costs associated with isolation, particularly for young people. I think 1,500 psychologists and pediatricians recently wrote to the government to talk about the significant impact that they fear for young people's mental health as a result of lockdown. And that really comes from the reduction of social contact, which is so important for the development of the teenage brain. We need to get beyond our current circumstances, absolutely, but also we need to be sensible and be aware of risk. Well, one of the key points here is that feeling comfortable is a comfort blanket, and feeling discomfort is often what drives people away from the things that actually they need to press into. And I would challenge people to accept a level of discomfort and actually describe it as being good for them, rather than thinking, I feel uncomfortable, I've got to now retreat. I would always say, if you're exposing yourself in context of anxiety pressures, when you start to feel uncomfortable, that's when your exposure is beginning to work. So if it's too easy, you won't feel uncomfortable at all. If it feels a little bit uncomfortable, then it's challenging, and therefore you're beginning to push anxiety back. None of us are actually designed to feel comfort all the time. We should have a level of disquiet in our emotions when certain things are happening, and our lives will never be a sort of lovely security blanket. And so we have to kind of feel difficult emotions and actually know that feeling them is absolutely okay. Just because we feel them, it doesn't mean that we need to retreat. So we say, feel the feelings and do it anyway. So if you feel the feelings and then do whatever you're going to do anyway.
That is really helpful, and it ties in beautifully with one of the questions that someone asked, and that was someone wrote in to me before the seminar actually, and basically said that she's struggling to get out of bed every day because she's so worried about what might happen kind of outside the four walls, that it takes her a really long time to get out of bed, and then that disrupts family life. So could you just give just a couple of kind of suggestions, thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, again, my caveat is someone is really struggling to get out of bed in the morning. That might indicate that there are more significant problems for them than just the motivation. I mean, if it is literally just fear that's keeping someone from getting out of bed, that's called procrastination, and it's putting off something which we don't want to do because we believe that we will feel badly as a result of doing it. The more common is for someone to be slightly depressed, and then they sleep poorly, and then they're unable to get going in the morning. So again, recommendation is to talk to your GP online and have a conversation about that. But if it is more of a procrastination issue where someone is reluctant to get going, the key thing is to break your day down and have a strict routine. I mean, in terms of advice for teenagers, one of the most important constructs for young people is to have a routine every day and to stick to that routine. One of the most important things is not to go nocturnal, which is very tempting at times like these. So the recommendation is to get up every day before 9 a.m. and to go to bed at a reasonable time before midnight. Every hour before midnight of sleep is worth 2 hours after midnight. So if you go to bed at 10, you actually get 4 hours of sleep before midnight rather than just 2. So keeping a healthy routine, eating normally and well at 3 regimen points in the day is really significant, and doing at least half an hour of cardiovascular exercise every day. That doesn't mean that you have to run, but certainly walking briskly to get your heart moving. All of those things will help to develop confidence, and the routine and the security of the routine can help us deal with problems every day. But I think the key point is resting unduly will not help. It's actually the process of staying in bed is effectively battening down the hatches and hoping it's all going to go away. And ultimately, that strategy will lead to a sense of deep failure or depression as a result of really not feeling like they're able to cope with the circumstances when they really open up. So it's best not to hunker down and then suddenly be told, right, everyone's going back to work. It's best to have hunkered down and then stepped your recovery back to a normal routine, so that when the door fully opens, you can step out of it with confidence. And I would start that journey now.
And I think that's the important thing, isn't it? It's just taking what is the next step for you. It might not be a major step, but it's a step in the right direction. If you've recently joined us, welcome to the webinar on managing anxiety. Me and Will and I are having a great chat all about it. And someone has just texted in a question, and that is about the role of meditation, mindfulness in managing anxiety. What are your thoughts on those? Would you recommend them?
Absolutely. I mean, we have two sorts of nervous system: the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And one part of our nervous system is about security, which we've already talked about. So there's the three systems of the body, effectively: security, recovery, and productivity. And the security system is the one that's responsible for anxiety. But there's equally a calming system, another part of our sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, that counteracts our anxiety and helps us to settle again. And you can actually stimulate that practically through meditation, breathing exercises, visualization. Those things are really healthy. So a key strategy to stimulating that part of ourselves might be something like box breathing, which is a really simple technique where you breathe in for 4, you hold your breath for 4 beats, you breathe out for 4, and hold your breath again for 4 beats before breathing in again. So box breathing techniques are really great, because when we're nervous, we hyperoxygenate our blood. So when someone becomes anxious, they begin to overbreathe, which brings too much oxygen into their bloodstream. And that's the beginning of a panic attack. Because of the fight or flight mechanism, if a bear breaks into your house in the woods, you start breathing very quickly, because you need to flood your body with oxygen so your muscle groups can use that oxygen to run really quickly. And your blood is filled with two hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. They make your pupils dilate. They draw all the blood away from your exterior limbs towards your heart, and your heart rate increases, so you can perform superhuman tasks with superhuman strength. When you're having a panic attack, there is no bear and there is nowhere to run, but you're experiencing the same physiological symptoms. And stimulating your parasympathetic nervous system to calm everything down again rebalances your blood oxygen levels by increasing carbon dioxide, not oxygen, and help you to relax your whole body. And they actually back you away from a panic attack. So there's a few simple things you can try. One of the ways in which we can build ourselves up to panic and anxiety is by clenching. Now, if you've watched any of those horrible police camera action videos, you'll see men and women who are about to fight start doing this. They start pumping their fists. And what happens when you pump your body and tense it is it sends messages to your brain saying that you're under threat. Now, a lot of people secretly pump their body by crossing their body, crossing their legs, crossing their arms, or holding themselves. And all of that pressure creates a feeling of imminent threat in your brain. So the first thing to do is unfold. And one of the best ways to doing that is uncrossing your legs and placing your hands palm side up on both knee. And then drop your shoulders, and that's the posture from which you begin relaxation. And then if people feel like they're moving towards panic attack, the best thing they can do is breathe only through their nose. It's very hard to have a panic attack by oxygenating through your nose. So if you close your mouth and only breathe through your nose, it's a bit like breathing into a paper bag, which is an old trick that people used to use to get away from that kind of level of anxiety. And when you're in a state of relaxation, you can't actually have an anxiety attack and also be relaxed at the same time. So the best antidote to anxiety in physiological terms is actually by meditation, breathing exercises and relaxation. Some people, again, will need some extra support from their GP, normally by the way of those benzodiazepine medications that help their body to relax, if you like, in a medical way. But you can use these breathing strategies and muscle relaxing strategies to overcome worry, as well as a tool which actually can mean that you can let go of the medication over time and just use these strategies. Personally, I haven't needed medication for 14 years, and I've just used strategies around mindfulness meditation, breathing and relaxing exercise, muscle relaxing exercises as a way of controlling my anxiety. So it's really powerful.
Yeah, it just shows how powerful it is, doesn't it?
Yeah. Some people have a reservation that they think that mindfulness meditation is a Buddhist practice. Just to be clear, I mean, obviously, any Buddhists on this call will say it is, and they'd be right. It has been used within the Buddhist religion for millennia. But actually, mindfulness meditation is not a religious skill. It's actually common to all people. So Christians might talk about something called watchfulness, which is in the Bible, about some women who had lamps and were cleaning their house. Effectively, the idea was that you could keep your lamp lit whilst also attending to the needs of the house. So it's this kind of split-focused idea that you can hold something, maybe something uncomfortable, like a flame in your hands, but also attend to the things that you need to attend to. So mindfulness meditation might be knowing that you're feeling anxious and holding the feeling of anxiety whilst attending to the things that you still need to do. So it's kind of there, but it's not dominating your attention. You're mindful of it, but you're not overwhelmed by it. So there's lots of stuff on our site about mindfulness meditation, and lots of GPs now call it third wave CBT, so third wave cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's just to get away from the idea that people might be nervous about religious practice or religious connotations. But highly recommended.
And just tell everyone your website, just so they know where to find resources.
Yeah, sure. So it's just mindandsoulfoundation.org, or they could just Google me, or we're at Mind and Soul UK on all the social channels, or again, you can just look at me at Will Van Der Hart, and you'll find all our stuff. Yeah. But I always encourage people to sort of an armory of visualization techniques, breathing techniques, and relaxation techniques that they can call upon at times of stress and anxiety to then use to help to settle themselves in difficult situations.
It's almost a bit like having a toolbox, isn't it? And you know which tool to get out at the right time.
Absolutely, and that breeds confidence. So yeah. Anxiety makes you feel like you're out of control and that you're going to have a panic moment and you're going to sort of visually sweat and people are going to wonder what's going on with you. And so that uncertainty propagates the problem of anxiety for many people. We're uncertain, and therefore staying at home feels more profitable. But when you actually are confident to use particular tools that help to diminish the amount of anxiety that you're experiencing, especially if it becomes panic orientated, then you feel more and more confident. So it's like, climbing a mountain with the right gear. If you know you've got the right gear, if you fall off, you've got a rope to hold you, you've got a harness around your waist, you've got a helmet on your head. It's difficult, but you're going to be okay. So that's what we really would encourage people to think about, is getting a toolkit together of cognitive tools that they can use to help them when anxiety strikes.
And if someone knows that certain events, so we've had a question where if you have to go to a certain event and you know that it's going to make you anxious, what would you suggest? Is this basically like this toolbox idea? Could that be used for that, or would you suggest something else?
Absolutely, but again, it depends very much on context. I mean, I'm not a masochist. I don't go around looking for settings that are basically really, really difficult for me to deal with and then force myself into them. If I'm feeling uncomfortable in normal circumstances, I push myself through. For example, like my wife hates this, but if she says, "Did you lock the doors?" I always refuse to go back. And the reason I refuse to go back is I'd rather be burgled than have my life controlled by the idea that every time I go away somewhere, I have to go back to check the doors. Because I know for me, if I started that process, I'd probably keep on going back to check the doors.
Yes.
So on that level, I have to push through my anxiety and take a few risks. If, though, someone is writing in and there's a setting that is traumatic for them because of some person who's been in their life who's been very difficult, they don't want to encounter them again, or some particularly difficult event that's happened in a physical setting that they don't want to be necessarily exposed to, then I would say don't go. But if this is, I'm really nervous about going to school, I would say go, because you need to be there. So it's really, the question is this a one-off event, or is this something that is a regular? And is this an important event? Because if it's really important, it might be one-off, but the benefits of going will outweigh the costs of going. In my experience, most people who push through don't regret pushing through.
Yeah. And this is a big subject, so I know we can only talk about it for a short amount of time, but when you've got a child who is very anxious about, say, going to school, or you're noticing they become anxious about socializing or things, what tips would you give parents who are worried about their children? Sure.
Well, you're talking to the right person, because I have 3 children. One of them has quite significant struggles with anxiety. Again, probably genetic. There's a 40% prevalence of genetic transmission of vulnerabilities towards anxiety and depression. So my daughter does struggle with anxiety, and she struggles getting to sleep. She worries that she's not going to get to sleep, and sometimes she worries about events at school. I mean, I think the first thing for parents to do is not to diminish your child's problem. And most parents are nervous about talking about emotions with their children, because they believe if they do, they're going to open Pandora's box and somehow pathologize their child. And that's actually not true. Your child's emotions won't be fueled by your willingness to talk about them. They'll actually be settled. And so it's really important that parents don't belittle or diminish a child's experiences by saying, oh, don't worry about it, or don't be so silly, which is something I hear quite a few parents saying to their children. Or they say to me, oh, my child's being really silly about school, or silly about going to whatever, the town, or whatever it is that they're worried about. So it's important not to diminish or embarrass a child about their emotions. And I tend to work really hard to talk to my children, particularly to my daughter. And so I have an everyday check-in when I put her to bed, which is, how have you been feeling today? I talk about intrusive thoughts with, I call them buzzy bees. And I talk about, I try to help my daughter to realize that if she swipes the bee and makes it angry, it's more likely to sting her, because she can't stop the bees coming into her world. So I quite often say, have you had any buzzy bees today? And if you have, what did you do? And she'll say, oh, I had a bit of a buzzy bee about this. And I said, well, what was your response? And she was like, oh, well, actually, I let it buzz around for a bit, and then it seemed to go away on its own. Or, I got really upset about it and I locked myself in the loo. So we talk about those things in more of a childlike language. I mean, she's a primary school child, but teens need to talk about these things too. And it's the alongside friend voice which parents need to adopt, not the condemnationary or even the fixer. I mean, a lot of parents quickly reel out all these facts for their teenagers, or buy them all these books that they haven't read themselves. What they really want is someone to listen to them. What they don't need is someone who's sort of telling them how to fix their problems. Mm-hmm. And so it's the empathetic, non-judgmental listening which will make all the difference for your child. And again, if you're really worried about your child's well-being, definitely start with your GP. There's lots of fantastic charities that support children's mental health out there. And just because your child might be struggling, it doesn't mean you've been a bad parent. Lots of parents don't want to get help because they feel guilty, or they worry that social services will get involved if they raise a concern about their child's mental health. And actually, 1 in 4 of us will have a mental health problem. Our children are struggling with mental health right now, particularly. I think the reality is that 1 in 4 teenagers will have experienced depression by the age of 19. So, 1 in 4 of us, will struggle in that way. It's really significant as a problem, and we need to be better at handling it and confident about it. 1 in 5 12-year-olds say they're stressed and struggling with anxiety. That's a lot of children. That's primary age children. 1 in 5 say they're stressed and struggling with anxious thoughts. So, we have to be confident in how we talk to children and young adults, and that's always in an empathetic, generous, and kind way. And explore together. There's some fantastic books out there as well for children and for teens around mental health that can really help them. But don't just buy one and give it to them. Read it with them is the best way forward.
Yeah. And the statistic 1 in 4, I mean, I've heard that quite a lot, and if we don't experience ourselves, we will more than likely know someone who does. Just quickly, can you just give us a few kind of ways that we can support other people who are experiencing anxiety?
I mean, we have a lot of people connected through the Mindsoul Foundation side, and they often will say something very simple, which is please tell. I mean, particularly we address the church. I'm a priest, and where they say, please can you tell all the Christians to stop trying to fix my problems and just to kind of pray for me, or like just ask me how I'm doing. I was thinking about it like this, if someone has a really rare form of cancer, you don't Google like rare form of cancer, do a short course and come back and see that person and say, hey, I've got some really great advice for you. You should take this vitamin pill, and you should eat this smoothie, and you should do these sort of exercises. They'd look at you and go, what are you talking about? I've got a top consultant who's looking after my illness, and I'm taking this really expensive medication that's really specialized. Why are you telling me this? But when mental health is concerned, people go online, look up a few things, and then say to someone, "Oh, I'm gonna fix you," and they're like, "What? What are you talking about? You've no idea, what to do." But that's their experience, and people believe, I think, falsely, that they can somehow fix people's mental health problems through a couple of clicks on Google. And our encouragement is to say, look, stop trying to fix your friends. Actually, what your friends really need, what will actually help your friends, is an alongside, accepting, supportive and loving presence. And if you really want to help someone with depression, ask them if there are any practical jobs that you can do for them that would give them a break. Because it might be, mowing their lawn once a week, or going to the shops and doing a big food shop for them, or supporting them going to the GP even, or it might just be giving them a phone call to say how they're doing, or feeding their cat. It's very rarely going to be about actually treating them. And so, if you're a friend, someone who's anxious, it's particularly important that you don't constantly reassure them. Reassurance is addictive for anxiety sufferers. So if they keep saying to you, is it going to be okay? And you say yes, you're actually feeding the beast of anxiety. What you should actually say is, I don't know if it's going to be okay, but I'm happy to take the risk if you are. So, be a support. And offer to be an alongside support. So that person could then go through the phases of exposure, or be an exit strategy for them. If I always say, with teams, if an anxious person wants to go to a party, just devise an exit strategy that's non-embarrassing before you leave, and then have a friend that can activate that. So it might be, there's a code word like, granny's ill, and then you're whisked away when it's unbearable, but go for as long as you can, don't not go, whatever it is. Think about strategies to help, but try not to either fix or be a sort of blanket of reassurance, because that would be problematic for them.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And the idea of not fixing ties in, I guess, with my next question, and that is, what role do you think that support groups can play in someone's journey with anxiety?
Well, I think support groups are a really, really helpful tool. I mean, my view is that therapy, psychotherapy, person-centered therapy is excellent. It's really helpful for people who are struggling with anxiety. The trouble is, it's also quite expensive, and the thresholds are quite high in terms of getting that sort of support now from the NHS, and understandably. Still, that shouldn't stop anyone from seeking support from their GP. But it is important, it is so important that you would still go if you were significantly anxious, because there is resource. But for people who have lower level struggles, support groups can provide a really fantastic alternative. So this is the kind of hive mind idea, where in a group of 10 or 12 other sufferers, you can discuss the circumstance of your anxiety. You can share strategies that are helping you, which is, again, not patronizing, because it's not necessarily people who haven't experienced your sort of struggle who are telling you these things. And then you can also hold one another accountable to some of the targets that you're setting for each other. So it can be really, really useful. And some courses can give you a very strong and clear physiological and psychological overview of what makes anxiety a problem for you, which is always helpful. Like, knowledge is power as far as anxiety is concerned. I really recommend the STEPS course. I think it's a fantastic course based on the 12 steps, which we know works really well for people who struggle with addiction issues, but I believe also works really well for people who struggle with anxiety issues, because whilst anxiety is not an addiction, we can become stuck where we feel the sort of release of relief when we've withdrawn from activity, and actually we garner greater confidence to begin to take a journey of freedom. So I think STEPS is a great place to start. There's a fantastic set of groups called Kintsugi Hope Groups, which again, they run a fantastic set of groups to support people struggling with anxiety. Mercy UK run a fantastic course, which is called Keys to Freedom, which again focuses on stages of recovery around anxiety. There's something called the Sanctuary Mental Health course, which is a great overview as well. So there's lots of tools out. There's a new course called the Character Course by Roger Bretherton, which I also recommend. I mean, all of these are listed or recommended through the Mindful Foundation site, so do go and have a look. The good thing about most of these courses is they're either free or there's very nominal payment for dinner, and they forge a community of like-minded people to discuss the issues and then to track forward from there. So if someone is struggling, it provides a really safe place to begin to disclose your struggle and get wisdom from others. And I've seen how groups can become a real lifeline for people who found things really troubling and really isolating over the long haul. So a group is a great place to go. It also is an exposure opportunity, because you're going to go there with a group of people you don't know particularly well into a setting which you might not have encountered before. And that takes some courage. So it's a great opportunity, even just as an exposure exercise.
And just to say that the STEPS course that Will mentioned is one that Christchurch run, the church who was hosting this webinar. And it is a 12-step recovery course, all about work. It's actually based on the AA model. So it's a way of working through an emotional issue. I've done this course many times, and I'm just such a fan of it. It's really had a transformational effect on my life. I do not work for STEPS, I'm not employed by them, but I just tell people about it because it has been so helpful for me in my journey. And anxiety is one of the topics that people sometimes come and work through. So as part of that 12 weeks, it's looking at making peace with yourself, making peace with God or your higher power, and making peace with other people. And the STEPS course is based on Christian content, but it is totally accessible for anyone of any faith or none. So if you are at all interested in exploring doing STEPS, then me and my friend Lars are actually running it's a Bring a Glass of Wine online on Zoom on Monday evening, Monday the 22nd at 8:30. And it's basically an opportunity to come and find out a little bit more about STEPS. Could it be right for you? Hear from probably me, and I'll just tell you a little bit more about my journey of doing STEPS and how it's helped me. If you are at all interested, you can go to info@stepscourse.org, and we will be able to give you some more information. So we would love to see you there if you can, and bring a glass of wine or a soft drink or anything you fancy. We haven't really talked much about faith, Will, but I know that is something that has really helped you over, your lifetime, really. I've heard a lot of your talks and heard you talking about faith. Can you just share a little bit about the difference it makes to you and, I guess, your anxiety?
Yes, sure. So, I'd say, faith has made a really big impact on my life. It's also been problematic at times where my anxiety has been concerned. So it's not a kind of single angle. I think what I've realized is that the Christian faith is what I believe very good for my mental health and for my anxiety. But sometimes some of the ways in which things have been interpreted or shared with me haven't helped me. So what I found is there's there's been quite a tradition in the church against that worry is the sin of not trusting God. And actually, the Bible is really good news for someone who struggles with anxiety. In Matthew 6:34, it says, "Don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Today has enough cares of its own." And that's actually a piece of cognitive behavioral therapy. So Jesus coined the first piece of cognitive behavioral therapy, which was effectively about saying, don't catastrophize the future because you can't change the future, but bring your focus of attention into the now and attend to the needs of the day. Where anxiety is concerned, everyone will know that you spend 90% of your time looking at things that will never happen, when actually there's quite a lot of significant things that need to be attended to in the moment, but you're distracted from those. So rather than being bad news for your mental health or being condemnatory towards your mental health, the Bible is actually very affirming and helpful, and it's filled with wisdom. So part of my resolve in the Mind and Soul Foundation, I work with 2 psychiatrists and 1 psychologist, is to help to translate the tools of psychology through a biblical lens to a Christian audience. What I'm delighted by is the fact that it doesn't take much translation, because actually the Bible is filled with great supportive ideas and wisdom for people's mental well-being. And the church, again, can be a fabulous community within which you might receive support and companionship and encouragement and love and non-judgmental listening. It equally can be at times stigmatizing and challenging and anxiety provoking. The good news for anyone listening to this who might be nervous about the church is that it's actually making huge progress in this area. And so churches like Christ Church London are transforming the landscape by including psychologically supportive ideas and principles and incorporating them amongst the tools of Scripture and understanding of the power and presence of God through the person of Jesus Christ. And that is in itself wonderful news. And so, from an independent perspective, psychological reports have shown that having a faith is good for your mental health. Prayer is good for your mental health. And so take away any supernatural belief, being a Christian is good news. But I believe as well that, in terms of therapists, I've had a lot of therapy over the years and I've paid for that therapy. But I get to talk to God every day, who knows my mind and knows my thoughts, yet he doesn't judge me because my guilt and shame are assuaged. And so that's a great relief. And it's also a great means by which I can stay emotionally healthy. So if anyone on this call has never tried praying before because they're worried that God might be a sort of, a kind of a draconian, judgmental God in the sky, then I'd love to invite you to think again and maybe explore Alpha as a way of doing that. Maybe explore a course like Steps at Christ Church. Just to sort of say, actually, let's begin a story of, story of faith. Faith is good for your health. And fortunately, the church has been built on the backs of loads and loads of people who have struggled significantly with their mental health, like Martin Luther, the father of the Reformation, or Charles Spurgeon, ostensibly the best preacher the UK has ever hosted, or Mother Teresa, who had 20 years of depression, streets of Calcutta, or William Cooper, who wrote the only hymns, or the list goes on. Florence Nightingale, who had bipolar disorder. Lots of Christian saints struggling significantly with their emotional health, but had strong faith, and they found their faith was a key to life and all its fullness. Yeah,
it's so encouraging, isn't it? And I'm glad you mentioned Alpha, because we actually have an Alpha course starting in early July. It's on Tuesday, the 7th of July, and that will be, as well as Steps, they're both going to be on Zoom. So if you are interested in Alpha at all and just exploring those big questions, is there a God? If there is, does he really care? What about suffering? All those big questions. No question is too big or too small. You can email alpha@christchurchlondon.org if you are interested. Or if you go to christchurchlondon/alpha, there is also more information there as well. And if you have, if the whole topic of faith has made you inquisitive, it's a really good time to try church, because you don't even need to leave your house. So Christ Church London have services every Sunday. You can just go onto our website and just click Church at Home, and no one needs to know that you've even watched. But I too find faith a really great source of strength and comfort in my own journey and my own mental health as well. And we're almost up, Will, but do you have any final thoughts or comments just to share with us before we end?
Well, thanks so much for having me on today. I mean, I think my parting sort of encouragement is for anyone who's anxious. It is a journey, and sometimes I was actually coaching with someone today who's just at an early stage of feeling overwhelmed, and they make one step forward and then they feel like they take one step back. And my encouragement is to think in terms of months, not days. There is no sort of perfect bell curve to anxiety recovery. It is a bit of a stop and start kind of an experience. And normally you'll start with 2 bad days and 1 good one, and then it'll flip to 2 good days and one bad one, and then 2 good weeks and then a bad week. But look at the overall trajectory of recovery and try and keep encouraging yourself. And again, as we said at the very beginning, anxiety is not something to edit out of your story, but it's something that just needs to be tuned into an appropriate level for the circumstance that you find yourself in. And my encouragement is not to berate yourself or beat yourself up about it, or be impatient about it, but know that actually it will settle in time. But do make sure that you don't allow shame or embarrassment to steal the supports that you might need to do well. Far better that you get the help that you need and you make a great recovery than you stall your recovery because you're afraid of talking about your struggle, and then it becomes more entrenched and more problematic over the long haul. So my most important advice is get help. And if you're in doubt, get help. It's far better to have asked for help and been told, actually, I think you're doing okay, than ask for help and then not ask for help at all. If you ask for help and you're told you're okay, you can walk away. You might feel mild embarrassment, but that's absolutely fine. But if you feel you need to talk to your GP, the likelihood is your GP will believe that you have needed to talk to him. And even if you don't walk away with a diagnosis or medication, that conversation will most likely have been a really helpful one for you. Yeah. So it's definitely a conversation worth having. And as I say, we would love to connect with you through MindSoftFoundation.org and help yourself to any of our with thousands of pieces of free resource on mental and emotional health that we would love you to use or to share, pass on, and we want you to be blessed and find that full life that's so worth living. Thanks so much again, Lou, for having me on today.
Thank you so much. This has been such a worthwhile and a really helpful discussion, just for me personally, and hopefully for a lot of other people. So thank you so much for your time. Just one other parting comment is that if you are struggling and would like some support from the church in any way, we have a pastoral team who would love to listen and pray for you. We're not counsellors in any way, trained therapists, but we do love to pray for people and provide a listening ear. So if that would be helpful to you, then you can email pastoralsupport@christchurchlondon.org. Thank you so much for tuning in to the webinar this evening. We hope you enjoyed it, and take good care.